Welcome to the Journal. The ancient Romans had a proverb: money is like seawater. The more you drink, the thirstier you become. That adage finds particular meaning today on Wall Street, which began this new year riding a tidal wave of bonuses in a surging ocean of greed. Thanks to taxpayers like you who generously bailed banking from the financial shipwreck it created for itself and for us, by the end of 2009, the industry's compensation pool reached nearly $200 billion. And despite windfall profits, the banks will claim almost $80 billion in tax deductions. And nearly $20 billion of those deductions will go to just three institutions: Morgan Stanley, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Goldman Sachs. Ah, yes, Goldman Sachs, that paragon of profit and probity, which bet big on the housing bubble, and when it popped, presto, converted itself from an investment firm into a bank so it could get your bailout money. Now consider this. In 2008, Goldman Sachs paid an effective tax rate of just 1%. I'm not making that up. 1%. While their CEO, Lloyd Blankfein, pulled down over $40 million. That's God's work if you can get it. And believe me, Wall Street bankers know how to get it. What's their secret? How do the bankers pick our pockets so thoroughly with barely a pang of guilt or punishment? You'll find some answers in this current edition of Mother Jones Magazine, one of the best sources of investigative journalism around today. Most of this issue is devoted to what the editors call Wall Street's accountability deficit. In it, the Nobel Prize economist Joseph Stiglitz writes of the moral bankruptcy by which bankers knowingly trashed our economy and tore up the social contract. The magazine's David Korn examines why there's no mass movement demanding fundamental change. And blogger Kevin Drum tours Washington's heart of darkness from down Pennsylvania Avenue over to K Street, then past the local branch of Goldman Sachs, also known as the U.S. Treasury, and up to Capitol Hill, where key members kneel in supplication to receive their morning tithes from the Holy Church of the Almighty Dollar. As Kevin Drum writes, a year after the biggest bailouts in U.S. history, Wall Street owns Washington lock, stock, and debit card. Kevin Drum, formerly with Washington Monthly, is now the political Mother Jones. He's here to talk about his report, along with David Korn, who's been covering Washington for 23 years and is now Mother Jones' Washington Bureau Chief. Welcome to both of you.
Good to be with you, Bill.
Glad you to come. Let me read you a letter that was posted on our website a few days ago from a faithful viewer. His name is Mike Dimmer. I don't know him personally, but I like to hear from him. He says, "Dear Bill, I watch your program all the time. What I don't understand is how a bunch of greedy bankers could bring the world to the edge of catastrophe and then in less than a year already move back to their old ways. How do they do it?"
Well, that's the $64 million question, or maybe it's the $64 billion question these days. You know, how they do it, they've got all the money. And they use all the money, and they use it in Congress to get rules passed and get laws passed that they want. They use it to lobby the Fed. They use it to lobby the SEC. They use it to lobby the executive branch. And they get rules passed that allow them to make a lot of money, just like any of us would. It's not that American bankers are greedier than anybody else's bankers. It's that our rules, our laws, allow them to do things that they can't do everywhere else. We let them take advantage of the system.
But how do you measure their power? Lobbying doesn't happen in the public, in the open. We can't sit in the bleachers and watch the game being played. How do you know they have this power?
You know, you can read the lobbying reports. You know that there are scores, if not hundreds, of lobbyists. And where do they come from? They come from the committees that they're lobbying. People used to work on the committee, whether they were members, congressmen or senators, or staffers. And they spend a lot of time because ultimately, Bill, this is about knowledge. This is about information. This stuff is really complicated and convoluted. And, you know, you try reading any one of these bills and figuring out what's actually being said. It's mystifying. And so these guys who know the rules, they know the language, and they have the access, and they're giving contributions to the people writing the rules, have all the advantages.
But Barney Frank would disagree with both of you. I don't know that he's read your piece yet, although
Yeah,
I'm sure he would. Barney Frank, chairman of the House Committee on Financial Services, and a liberal Democrat said the other day, look, I'm not affected by campaign contributions. The members of my committee are not affected by campaign contributions. The problem is democracy, he says. Everybody sitting on this committee represents somebody back home, a local bank, a car dealer, an insurance company, and they come to the committee and they press, as you do in a democracy, for their interests, as you just said.
But wait a second. I mean, when you look at something like derivatives, which were used to enable the subprime lending mess that led to the near collapse of the U.S. and global economy, I'm not sure there are bankers back home who are lobbying, the committee. There aren't local derivative dealers that you meet in Main Street when you go back to town hall meetings. It's a very small group of people who understand this, and we have seen, the Wall Street Journal is reporting this week that there's no real action on regulating derivatives.
I brought that story because I wanted to read it. Quote, lobbying by Wall Street has blunted efforts to step up regulation on derivatives trading by carving out exceptions or leaving the status quo in place. Derivatives took blame for some of the worst debacles of the financial crisis. But a year after regulators and critics began calling for an overhaul in the way they are traded, some efforts have been shelved and others have been watered down. What does it say when Mother Jones and the Wall Street Journal reached the same conclusion, that our government cannot stand up to the lobby, even on an issue like derivatives, which were at the root of much of our problem over the last few years?
Well, it doesn't say anything good, and derivatives are a good example of how this stuff works. I mean, take a look at what happened. Derivatives were at the center of the financial meltdown in 2008, and at first, everybody was all ready to regulate derivatives, and the big idea was to put them on an exchange, like a stock exchange, where they're all traded publicly and transparently. What happened was there were corporations. If you're an airline and you're worried about the price of jet fuel, you might want to buy a hedge the price of jet fuel. And so the airlines and some other companies went to Congress and said, look, those are derivatives, but they shouldn't be traded on the exchange because that's not the financial stuff that blew up the world. No problem. Everybody pretty much agreed they ought to be exempted from that. But then it's all in how you write the rules. So the rules got written, and as they slowly got changed, it turned out you've got to define who is an end user, who is a corporation as opposed to a bank. And the rules got written, and they got written a little more broadly and a little more broadly until eventually, if you read the rules right, it looked as though pretty much anybody was an end user. Goldman Sachs would end up being an end user, and 80% of the derivatives would have been exempt.
And what does that say to us?
It says that the banks are in charge, and they're in charge. They get people, right now banks are in, nobody wants to be around Goldman Sachs, right? So what they do is, what you were talking about, they get the car dealers and they get the local banks and the credit unions and so forth to basically front for them. And these corporations go in and they say, we want an end user exception, and they get it, and then all it takes is a few congressional aides here and there to change the wording a little bit.
Now, the interesting thing is, at this point, having a conversation like this, we've already lost. Because now we're arguing about how the technical side of things are handled. And what the Wall Street collapse didn't really lead, in Washington or any place else, was sort of a reevaluation of what finance is supposed to be about and what government's role might be in advancing a financial system that benefits citizens at large. Wall Street has become a place, and the banking industry, where you don't lend money to improve local businesses and industry. You basically, create new, they call them instruments, devices, to make money yourself. It's really turned into nothing except a casino in which they lend money and then they make bets and bets on the side bets about what's going to go up and down. So a lot of the action is really, at the end of the day, not about providing credit and keeping capital flowing. It's about how they think they can make more money through more trades.
Yeah, I was struck by that paragraph in your story where it said that the financial industry has persuaded us, convinced us over the last 30 years that the purpose of the financial industry is not to serve companies needing capital or consumers needing credit, but to make money for themselves. And you go on to say that in a very fundamental way, this financial lobby has changed America. What do you mean by that? That goes deeper than campaign contributions and money and even influence in Washington. You say they've changed our framework.
Yeah, it goes a lot deeper. It's what Simon Johnson, the former chief economist for the IMF, it's what he calls intellectual capture. And it means
intellectual capture.
Right. It goes beyond regulatory capture, where say the banks control the SEC. That's one thing. Capture means that essentially the financial industry has convinced us. In the 50s, what was good for General Motors was good for America. Now it's what's good for Wall Street is good for America, and they've somehow convinced us that we shouldn't ask about what's right or what works or what's good for America. We should ask what's productive, what's efficient, what helps grow the economy.
This is the Stockholm Syndrome, where your hostage starts identifying with the people holding them captive. Americans have been, told over and over again that if the Dow's going up, if Wall Street's making money, it's good for you.
Often when workers are being laid off.
Yes,
Right.
Other measurements of the economy aren't aren't held in such high esteem. And so when I was talking to members of Congress and pollsters about why there was not more popular, revulsion against Wall Street that was leading to action in Washington, Congressman Brad Sherman, he's a Democrat in California, he led during the whole TARP argument what he called the Skeptics Caucus. They were kind of opposed, but they were just raising questions. And he says the problem is that people are told that if you don't serve Wall Street, Americans will be out in the streets fighting for rat meat. That basically the
rat meat?
Rat meat. Those are his words, not mine. I never think I ever would come up with that image. But that basically we'd all be out fighting for grub on our own. And that so what happens is people are, while they're angry at Wall Street, particularly on the corporate compensation front, which is very easy to get angry about, they also are fearful of taking Wall Street on because they've been taught that if the Dow falls, if you take on the big banks, it's going to be bad for all of us. So it really is this Stockholm Syndrome where we're forced to identify with people who are holding us hostage without our interest in mind.
So your conclusion from all of this is, and I'm quoting you, the simplest, most striking proposals for reining in bank behavior aren't even getting a serious hearing.
Right. Back in March of last year, Congress was considering a bill to deal with bankruptcy and home foreclosures. And the Obama administration thought this bill was a shoo-in. They really didn't think they were going to have any problem passing it. And it failed. And
it failed. You mean it was beaten?
It was beaten by the banks. They got the bill rewritten. And in fact, not only did they get the bill rewritten the way they liked it, they actually got several $1 billion of extra bailout money put in at the same time.
This was the so-called cram-down proposal that was designed to help homeowners who were in trouble get through the hard times?
That's right. And I think what happened was the Obama administration saw what happened with a bill that they thought would pass easily, and they realized what they were up against. And so even their original proposals, I think they were watered down even before they went to Congress. And then once they're in Congress, they get watered down some more. And once it gets to the Senate, it's going to get watered down even more.
So if we get financial reform at all, it will be financial reform riddled with loopholes to benefit the very people who got us in this mess in the first place?
It's going to be financial reform on the margins. Complexity is the friend of the financial industry. If you really want to control them, you need simple rules. So, for example, Paul Volcker, former Fed chairman, he thinks that we ought to simply prevent banks from being in the securities business. They should make loans, they should underwrite bonds, they should give advice on mergers and acquisitions, the sort of things they've done for years. But they shouldn't be trading securities. We should leave that to hedge funds. We should leave that to other people.
Let them take the big risk. Don't take the big risk with the money you and I deposit.
Don't take risks inside the banking system where you can blow up the world.
Well, you're also federally insured.
Right.
Right, with our money.
It's government